In today's PowerPoints, we'll be going over child development and a short overview and introduction of the study of child development. The study of child development is really a research-based study of children from the ages of before birth up until around age 20. We'll also be looking at children through the lens of domains, which is our physical domain, our cognitive domain, and our psychosocial, which is sometimes also referred to as social and emotional domain. So we'll be looking at children as they're growing up and right before they enter into early adulthood, and we'll be looking at them through the areas of development. So how a child grows, what their health is physically, and then cognitively, how they learn intelligence-wise, and then also within social and emotional or psychosocial, so how you grow as a person and how your personality develops. So specifically, the periods of development that we're going to be looking at are the prenatal period. So this is conception. This is when the basic bodily functions are starting to grow within the womb. And then also how we are exposed to environmental issues before birth as well. Then we move into our infancy and our toddlers. So that's ages 0 to 3. When we're first born, how are we growing at such a rapid pace, going from a teeny tiny newborn all the way into a toddler who's walking and talking. And then our early childhood, our ages 3 to 6. So kind of transitioning from a toddler into a preschooler, and then also into your first couple years of formal schooling at an elementary school. And then our middle childhood, which is about ages 6 to 11, 6 to 12. And those are sometimes referred to as our forgotten years. Children have done most of their rapid growing by this point, and they're working on a lot of social and emotional issues. And so a lot of times we more focus on our adolescents and our infants and toddlers, and sometimes forget about children in the middle childhood age. Then finally, we'll look at adolescence, which is 11, 12 years old to ages 19, 20. A time when you're a teen, you're growing, you're moving out of your parents' sphere of influence, and starting to encounter the community and the larger world on your own. And then once again, the domains of development that we'll be going over in this course. So that's our physical, so how we grow and develop. So we'll also be going over health and how to keep children healthy and safe. But the big domains of physical development are gross motor skills, which is how we use our large body system. So being able to kick a ball, being able to run, being able to move our whole entire body, and then our fine motor development, which is the ability to use our fingers and our hands and things like that to like thread beads, cut with scissors. So the physical development is motor skill development, and within that is gross and fine motor development. Then we'll look at psychosocial development. In this course, I will refer to psychosocial and social and emotional interchangeably. Within my job, in addition to being an adjunct instructor here at Palomar, I also teach young children with special needs in their homes. So I provide in-home therapy, and I work with parents. I coach them, and I help them in how to educate their young child with like Down syndrome or cerebral palsy. So I help the parents support their growth at home as well. So when I'm talking to those parents, I try to use the most accessible language that I can in order to teach them about their child and how to help their child grow. So I wouldn't say psychosocial, I would probably say social emotional. So for me, these are two interchangeable terms, and it's really just going over how you are as a person. How are you growing emotional wise? Can you regulate yourself? So when you're angry, helping a 2-year-old not hit when they're angry, self-help, the ability to use the bathroom, to dress yourself, to feed yourself, and then how you engage with relationships with others. And then finally, the domain that we also be looking at is cognitive, and this is also sometimes known as intelligence or brain ability. So this is our communication and our language. It's the ability to learn, to reason, to use logic, and it also involves the ability to think creatively and come up with alternative solutions to problems. We're also going to look at child development within the context of the environment. So there's that age-old discussion of nature versus nurture. And we're going to talk about that in some part, but we're really going to look at environment and genetics as interrelated in this course. So who I am as a woman who was raised in Southern California in the 1980s is going to be very different from somebody who was raised in Norway in the 1700s. So both our place and time within history, our environment, our culture, and our genetics is going to be very, very different because of the time that we were born, the location that we were born, and other related contexts like that. So when we look at a child and we look how they're developing, we're going to be looking at their genetics. So what kind of genetic makeup were they born with? What kind of heredity and genetic information did they receive from their family? And then once the child is born, what kind of environment were they raised in? What socioeconomic status were they? What community did they live in? And then culture, race, and ethnicity as well, and a language spoken at home as well, will also play into the child and how they grow and develop. Then your immediate family and if you were raised outside of your immediate family with your adopted family or maybe a very large extended family will also play into how the child develops. We'll also be looking at the idea of epigenetics, which is the study of above. So that means epi means above genetics, and this is the idea that our genetic expression can be influenced by the environment and the care that we receive after we're born. So it's a very new and interesting look at the study of child development, and that'll be something that all of these contexts we will look at as we delve more into the study of child development throughout this course. So in the past slide, I talked about how myself being raised in the 1980s in Southern California is going to have a big impact on how I was raised and thus how I developed as a child. Some of the issues that affect this are the ideas of normative or non-normative events. So a normative event is something that affects many people, and then a non-normative event is something that just affects the individual. Then we have this idea of a cohort, which is a group of people generally born in the same time. And then there's a historical generation, so a group of people that were influenced by historical events. So for me, a normative event would have been when the Challenger exploded. And for some of you that are younger, the Challenger exploded in the 1980s, and it was a NASA spaceship that exploded going into orbit. The interesting thing is that they had a teacher on board, a kindergarten teacher named Mrs. McCulloch, and she was going up in that. And so this generated a lot of interest within the elementary schools, and we all kind of followed her journey, and we had little scholastic newspapers about it. I was in pre-K, so I was about to go into kindergarten when this event happened. So I'm lucky in that I didn't see it live, but for my brother-in-law who's older, he was in the classroom and they had a TV and they were actually watching it live when the Challenger blew up and Mrs. McCulloch died. So it was a normative event that affected many people that were born in the 1980s or late 1970s in the United States, and that a lot of elementary school students were affected by this death of this kindergarten teacher. So that's a normative event from my life that affected my child development. Then there's non-normative events, so this was something that would just affect the individual. A lot of times it could be something traumatic, like for example, if a child had a parent pass away in their early childhood, that would be a non-normative event that it would affect the individual. Then there's our cohort, so it's a group of people that are generally born at the same time. So this could also plays into, although they are different, it's kind of the idea of a generation. So you were born at the same time as a bunch of people, and so you experience things that happened in generally the same way, because if you were 4 years old when the Berlin Wall fell, then you all would have kind of experienced that at the same period of your child development. Then we do have our historical generations. So it's a group of people that are influenced by historical events. So our grandparents, our great-grandparents were affected by the Depression and World War II. Going off to war, coming back, things like that. Those are historical events that shaped them as a generation. So I want to give an example as well. So a normative event is 9/11, that happened to a lot of us, and then our involvement within Afghanistan and Iraq. And since we are near the military base Camp Pendleton, and that's somewhere where I worked for many years with young children, it did shape military children into this cohort group. So it's a group of children that were born while they were having frequent deployments. So this is something that we called our new normal. So all of the children who were born in the late 90s and after experienced these frequent deployments, and they knew nothing else. They didn't know the relative peacetime of the 1980s and 90s when deployments were very, very infrequent. The children now only know frequent deployments. So that's their cohort group, and that they're experiencing this, and they're experiencing deployments of any parent at a very formative time in their life. So then a non-normative event would be that a military child who is part of the cohort group, so they're born near to 9/11 and experienced many deployments. A non-normative event would be if that parent dies in combat. So it's affecting that child and that family structure in a very specific way, in that that child experiences the death of the parent in addition to being part of a group of children who were born after 9/11. And then as a historical generation, we all experienced 9/11, and we were all kind of shaped by it because it happened to a group of us within the history of the United States. So I'm going to go over some theorists. So these are kind of the giants or the titans within our field, people that I will be sourcing back to throughout the entire course, and are really the fundamental of the study of child development. So any other classes that you'll take in education or in child development, Palomar and then other schools as well, are going to talk about these theorists and the perspectives or the categories that they fit within. I have a bachelor's in child development and from a local university here in San Diego, and then I also have a master's in childhood studies from a university in England, so the University of London. And in both of those locations and in any courses that I've taken within the education realm, the sociology of childhood realm, or the child development realm, have gone on to talk about these perspectives. So the psychoanalytic perspective, learning perspective, cognitive perspective, contextual or sociobiological perspective or theories, and then the specific theorists that make up the work, or the most of the work within these specific perspectives or theories. So when I'm talking about these guys, I am looking, I'm sourcing a lot of it from page 12 of your textbook, or if you don't have a textbook, going online and finding some credible sources that have to do with Freud, Erikson, Skinner, Pavlov, Bandura, Piaget, Vygotsky, and Bronfenbrenner, and then Bowlby and Ainsworth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all of them specifically, just to give you some information, because if you've looked at the first PowerPoints from this class, you know that I talk about theorists as part of your research paper. So a topic that you might want to pick would be to learn more about one of these perspectives or theories, and then one of the theorists as well. So within our psychoanalytic, we first have Freud. So Sigmund Freud, I know all of you have heard that name before. He was really the, some people say great-grandfather, I say great-grandfather. He was alive in the 1800s. You know, a cigar is just a cigar, that type of stuff. He talks about the id, the ego, the super ego, and his whole idea was really that our behavior is controlled by these unconscious urges, and that are really the biology of who we are as men or women, or how we grew up, really shapes our development. So he was one of the first people to talk about child development, and that's why we still kind of look back to the theories that he had. They're not 100% used right now within the work that we have. He's really, like I said, the great-grandfather, the first person to think about child development as a specific time within our life where we are developing as young children. Then from there, within our psychoanalytic as well, we also have Erikson, and he has psychosocial or social-emotional developmental stages. So he really thought that our personality and who we are and how we develop is really influenced by society, and then through a development of ourself through stages. So the very first one is trust versus mistrust. So an infant, when they cry, if they are picked up and fed or loved or played with, they begin to trust that they are safe and welcome within the world. And they learn as young infants to trust the people around them. If an infant cries and they're left to be in a soiled diaper, or they're not given food, or people don't pay attention to them, they grow mistrustful about the world around them, and that also shapes their development. So that's really the beginning of Erikson's psychosocial developmental stages, and we're going to talk about each of his stages as we go along, because he has very specific stages throughout the lifespan that we're going to talk about in this class whenever we talk about psychosocial or social emotional development. Then we have kind of our learning theories or learning perspectives, and one of the first people is Skinner, and he really, when you talk about Pavlov, we're talking about classical conditioning. So there's the dog, the bell rings, he gets food, you know, and eventually when the bell rings, he starts to salivate because the bell goes off. And that's Pavlov, and he was really the beginning. But then we have Skinner, who took that classical conditioning and he made it into operant conditioning, or more consequences of behavior. So really what it is we respond to the environment, and the environment has some control or influence on our behavior. So a toddler who hears the door ring or the door open will start to associate with the door opening with dad coming home at the end of the day. Then also within that we have Bandura's social learning theory. So really what that is this idea that the world acts on the child and the child acts on the world. So by observing people, things, and the environment around us, the child is learning how to engage within the world, and they're active contributors to their learning. And we'll go more into that as well. Then we also have cognitive, and the big guy in our cognitive is Piaget. So he was a Swiss gentleman who, actually Piaget and Vygotsky, who are cognitive titans within this theory, were actually born in the same year, but Vygotsky died in his 30s, whereas Piaget lived well, I think he was in his 90s, it was in the 1980s, so when the time when I was born and developing, he died then. So when Piaget is talking, he's talking about stages of cognitive development and how we learn and how we cognitively process the information around us and adapt to new information. We are going to go through just a few stages of his cognitive development. It goes the entire lifespan, as does Erikson's, but we're only going to be concerned about the ones that have to do with how children learn. And then we have Vygotsky as well, and Vygotsky and Piaget are both within the cognitive theory, but they have similar and different ideas about how children learn. He really focused on the social environment, peers, and teachers, and how we support learning. Then we have contextual, which is the bioecological theory, and that was really pioneered by Uri Brafenbenner. And really what he thought is that development is kind of an interaction between the developing person and then kind of systems around them. So your family, your community, your school all work together to shape the environment around the child and shape the child's development. Then our very last one, the last theory or perspective that we're looking at, is sociobiological, and that was really Bowlby. He's a British gentleman who really looked at the attachment of infants and how that attachment shapes our development. During the Blitz, so that's when the Nazis were bombing England during World War II, a lot of children were taken out of England, taken out of London, the urban centers, and put into the countryside where they would be safer. But for many of them, they had to leave their mothers and their fathers and their families behind and go live with farm families, people that took them in order to keep them safe through this bombing that was happening in the urban centers. And so he was really looking at the ramifications of this kind of thing that happened to all of these children, and how attachment and being taken away from the attachment of your immediate family can shape your development. So I've given you a bunch of perspectives and theories and theorists. You could choose some of these to talk about in your research paper. Reading more about it, if any of these kind of piques your curiosity, or looking through our book or through some information at the library will give you some ideas about possible research paper topics. So the research that we use in the child development field. So we make sure that within child development, we really try to use research to inform the decisions that we have, or the information or the theories that we have about children. So it's not just things that we kind of make up like, oh, I've noticed. It tries to be a research-based study of children. The types of research designs that we commonly use are case studies. So this is objective study and observation of an individual child and how they interact with their environment and the social situations around them. We also have ethnographic studies, which are more cultural studies. So looking at a group of people and how they interact and are formed and then form and interact and change the cultures around them. Because before, when I talked about where you grow up, the time you grow up, the culture that you grow up is going to affect the development of the child. Then we have longitudinal studies. So this is a way of studying people throughout the lifespan. The best example that I can give for this is called the Up series. So this is a bunch of documentaries that follow the lives of children in England, and it's now been going on for almost 50 years, probably more than 50 at this point. So they did it every 7 years. They would check in with the children that they were following, and each 7 years they would get a glimpse into how they have developed as children, both within the wider world around them and also within their family systems. So that would be a longitudinal study. Something else that would be a more informal example of a longitudinal study would be a mother or a father who takes a picture of their child on the first day of school, and you see how the child grows and develops and how tall they are throughout the years on their first day of school. So that was an informal example of a longitudinal study. A more formal example as well would be we have a high scope longitudinal study, and this was looking at the curriculum that's used within Head Start throughout the country and seeing if it affects the development and the cognitive development and the success of the children who are exposed to young academic curriculums as young children in a preschool. So they've done studies in this, I think, the Department of Education. So they've looked at children who went to preschool through a federal program called Head Start, and then they've looked at their success rates, like if they've graduated from high school, if they've gone to college, if they're in stable relationships, all this type of stuff, what kind of jobs they hold over a long period of time to see if being exposed to high quality early education has impacted their development or not. We also use experiments. And I know it sounds kind of crazy, experimenting on children, but typically it's done in labs or in the field. They're observing children within more natural parts of their lives. So for example, my twins, I have fraternal, so they're not identical. They look very different, they act very different, but they are twins who was born at the same time. I take them to UCSD every once in a while to participate in lab experiments. So when they were infants, they watched a television screen, and they had different kind of staticky vision things for them to look at, because they were looking at what young children could process with their eyes at 4 months old. Like what could they see, what couldn't they see, as far as like lines on a screen, fuzz on a screen, that type of stuff, because they were looking at like visual processing skills. And then as they've gotten older, they've been interviewed now that they have really good language skills and they can talk about their lives and what they do. And then they've also interviewed me, or I've done like a survey or something like that. So that's typically how a really great university like UCSD learns from children in lab experiments. And they've also done experiments, and you could Google the marshmallow experiment on YouTube. It's an example of children who are given a marshmallow with the expectation that if they don't eat it, they'll get another marshmallow in a couple years. So this is an example of how we also work with young children or children in middle childhood to see how they react to various stimuli. So this is just an example of all the different types of research we do that then informs the textbook and the information that we give you. So we're trying to make sure that the information we've given to you has been coming from a research place, which means that it's more valid than just things that we think about children. This is a silly video. It's called Correlation versus Causation. And I think just generally within your lives, it's very important that we know what correlation is and what causation is. A lot of times, and I see this a lot online, people take two different sets of data and they can draw a correlation between it, but not causation. And so they think that that gives it some valid information, and It might and it might not. So knowing what the difference between correlation and causation is really important within the child development field, or any kind of research that has to do with humans and individuals. I think also when we are online and we are having a position given to us, if it draws from correlation or from causation, that's going to give us some more information about how valid it is. So this is a little funny video that's going to give you some information about that, and it's called How Ice Cream Kills. So in conclusion, child development and the study of child development really looks at children from a few different perspectives. So we're looking through time periods and then also through domains. So we're looking at physical development, social and emotional or psychosocial development, and then cognitive language development. And then also through periods. So how an infant learns is going to be really different from how a teen learns. We're also looking at them as part of an environment and how it affects them, and then in turn how they then affect the environment around them. We're also including the ideas of the individual experience, so what you experience as a person in your own life, and then the larger historical and cohort experiences. So how my grandmother was treated when she was born in the 1920s is going to be really different than how I was treated when I was born in the early 1980s. So there's really historical experiences, cohort experiences, generational experiences that also shape who we are. So her growing through the Depression and me then living through a very smaller recession that started in the late 1980s is going to be really, really different experiences. And then I also want to make sure that we know that this is research-based. I expect you to draw from quality research when you're writing your research paper, and then I, in turn, am citing or sourcing from research as well when I talk about children and childhood development.